Hi, at Twingate, we're looking to provide a lightweight approach to implementing zero trust as we move away from physical networks being the center of gravity to more of a model where user identity, device trust, and context are incorporated into securing remote access.
Hello everybody, and welcome to today's webinar presentation, Increased Security with Ephemeral Access Control, brought to you by Twingate. I'd like to introduce you to our presenter, Alex Marshall. Alex is the CPO and co-founder of Twingate, where he is responsible for product design, pre-sales engineering, and technical support. Alex loves solving problems with talented teams and building new, elegant solutions to technically complex problems. Prior to Twingate, Alex had leadership roles at Dropbox, Bloomberg, and Autonomy. Alex graduated from Stanford University with a Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering. And with that, I will pass it over to Alex.
All right, thank you. Really excited to speak to everybody about this topic, and so yeah, we'll dive right in. Really appreciate the introduction. So as we were just talking about, so I'm one of the founders of Twingate, and our mission in the world is basically to drive towards a future where working from anywhere is secure. So for this particular topic, we really want to dig into, I think, an area that I think it's seen a bit of a resurgence, especially as companies have been moving towards more zero trust-like solutions. Okay, so let's dig in. So first things is let's actually define like what we're talking about. I think there's similarities and differences that we want to cover here between what people would talk about as privilege access versus ephemeral access. And so privilege access, so PAM solutions or solutions that people are pretty familiar with, has a couple, set of characteristics that I think are pretty different than taking an approach for ephemeral or just-in-time access. So for privilege access is generally broad, and very often it's actually network-wide. And so sort of like the classic example of that is being an employee at a company where you have access to a given set of resources using a VPN. So it's typically broad access, network-wide, and it's long-lived, which gets us to our next point. So most privileged access solutions involve some kind of either static, by which I mean really, assigned to you as an individual. So static keys or long-lived keys that maybe only need to be renewed or refreshed like once a year, which is fairly typical time frame. And so when people are looking at sort of managing privileged access, I think the attitude that you take when you're looking at privileged access is you're saying that we've got people that need to access things. That access be administered in a way that's like fairly broad, generally large swaths of like internal resources, and the trade-off there is it's actually fairly easy to administer, right? Because that access is tied to you as a user rather than being tied to a particular resource or application, which we'll talk about in a second. There's on the administration side, it's a little bit easier, but the trade-off there is that it does present a larger security risk. Okay, so what we talk about sort of in the security space is this idea of a blast radius. So if my credentials are compromised as a privileged user, well then what the attacker has access to is going to be everything that I have access to using that privileged account with fairly broad access. Okay, so those are some of the things on the privilege side. So when we talk about ephemeral access, what we're really talking about is a system or set of systems or processes where you're assigning users very short-lived access that are either based on perhaps time. So you have access to a given resource for a fixed amount of time, and optionally that can be renewed, or based on usage. So it's sort of like a user lose it policy for access. When we're talking about ephemeral access, like keys are fairly dynamic. So you might have a key that exists for that time-based example we talked about earlier. I have a key that works for a particular resource for a certain amount of time, and when that time expires, that key needs to be renewed, and you need to get a new key. One of the downsides on ephemeral access is because there's a lot more change happening, a lot more assignments of privileges. It can be a lot more complicated to administer. And if anybody's ever sort of gone down this route of trying to administer access with short-lived certificates, you'll know that it's a fairly complex process. But the benefit is if you can get it right and you can use a tool that helps you achieve that, is that you'll end up with, much reduced like security risk. And that's really, I think, what the theme of today is, like how you can actually prove security with ephemeral access, and that's the key. So if you can actually implement a system like this, you're going to have much lower security risks, since keys don't live a very long time. They're very specific, and so your blast radius is much reduced. And so sort of like contextually too, I mean, I think the thing to think about is that the world's like really changed in the sense that, having keys that give access like broad networks isn't really applicable to cloud computing environments these days. And so the broader overarching point here is that ephemeral access really is very well suited to how people are actually using cloud services today and how people work today. Right, so that's why I think it's really important. Okay, so moving on, next part. So yeah, so as we said, I mean, there's a bunch of different reasons why it's really difficult. So just to sort of like dig into this a little bit more, as I was mentioning on the last slide, when you're thinking about implementing a system with ephemeral certs, so for example, managing a system that assigns certificates for SSH access, I think most administrators would agree that there's two sides to this. Like, one is you can set up a system that assigns access, based on like short time periods or particular resources. But what you end up with is, with most solutions, is a lot of user pain. So users now need to sort of keep track of every different possible certificate that they have to access different resources, and it really isn't a very like practical way to manage things. And so again, that's why in most situations you end up falling back to that privilege access model, where you just have a key that gives you access to, let's say, everything on your development or your production network. And so what contributes to that is really just this lack of tooling and deployment support. And so the tools themselves, generally that are out there, generally do a good job of either one of two things. Like, one is like managing like the technical aspects of assigning these short-lived certificates for users to particular resources, but then don't take into account what that user experience is. Or in order to actually set it up in a way that makes it easy for the user experience, there's a really heavy lift on the back end in setting up these solutions and deploying them across every single node in your network that may require access. So the trade-offs there either have a really bad user experience or have to do a ton of work on the network engineering side to implement a system that actually gets you to this endpoint. And so, not surprisingly, it becomes a pretty big burden for people. And so that's why sort of on the resource side, when we talk about a resource, we're talking about like a destination application, right? So it could be or destination service or application. So it could be an application, the internal application. It could be a database. It could be just simply being able to SSH into a host. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about a resource. And again, because of these sort of like underlying problems with sort of the existing solutions or what's out in the space there now, it's actually really uncommon to be in a working environment where users are given specific access to individual resources, again, rather than entire networks. And so a lot of like what we see sort of in our customer base and what people have actually deployed is that you end up with like pretty fragmented set of solutions. So you end up with all kinds of different applications that manage like different parts of this process, and the burden falls on sort of like DevOps or IT teams that then sort of like manage this sort of patchwork of different solutions. Finally, so workflow. There's a couple different workflows here that I think that are important. Generally, again, as I'm sure you're aware if you've worked with employees in an organization, being assigned access resources isn't a static thing, right? There's always changes. People are moving into different teams. People need one-off exceptions for things. Things happen internally that need sort of more urgent access to something, for example. Processes change, so things are really changing a lot. And it's important, I think, when you're thinking about ephemeral access, to think about a solution that actually helps you with a particular, with the workflow part of this, to actually enable users to help themselves so that the burden, again, doesn't fall on administrative side. And the second part of this, the second part of the workflow side is delegated administration can also be pretty difficult. So again, like you need a system that supports a model where multiple levels of people can be given different levels of privilege to then be able to assign access like where it's appropriate. So I think that the end result is that because all these challenges really like layer up and add together, you end up with a situation where generally people aren't happy or don't land in a situation where access is being given to individual users for individual resources because it's just either super manual, needs to be scripted, or it's just pulling together a bunch of solutions and it becomes really difficult. Okay, so that being said, it is really, really important. And so we're very passionate about this. We spend a lot of time speaking to customers about all this. But the main sort of like things that we see as driving like why this is a critical critical position to adopt, tools notwithstanding, is a bunch of different benefits, right? So number one is if you can get it right, then you can sort of minimize like the amount of access management that actually needs to happen. So getting like a set of workflows in place, a set of policies in place that sort of automate a lot of this can actually remove the burden on the administrative side while also giving you those security benefits. Big one is that this middle one is eliminating over provisioning, right? So again, if you're looking to, from a security standpoint, reduce the blast radius of any credentials that are compromised, then it's really critical that you find some solution to basically eliminate this idea of like over provisioning access. So you want to give people to the smallest set of resources you can possibly assign them access to at any given point in time. The other one that we really comes up a lot is that it's a lot easier to give access to people than it is to take access away. Right? It's relatively difficult in most systems that we see to automatically remove access that remains unused, and that's a big part of like eliminating this over provisioning of privileges. And so if you can have a system in place where lack of access after a particular period of time means removing access, removing that privilege, removing that access to that system, then you're going to end up with, over time, you're going to end up a lot closer to the system, to configuration where you've actually reached this sort of state of least privilege access. Fitting with different workflows is really important. So we'll actually talk about a few different examples on how you do this, but fitting with those workflows means it'll actually get adoption internally. I think having a single source of truth is really important. So if your system is managed across, if your overall policies are managed across many different systems, then it just means it's that much harder to get it right. And so I think getting to a point where you have a single source of truth for all the policies and how different credentials should be managed, you're much more likely to be effective with it, and you're much more likely to actually end up with a secure solution. And that's really, I think, that the last point there is improving security posture. That's really what this is all about. If you can get all these things right, then your business is overall going to have be in a much stronger position from a security standpoint. Okay, so let's I think with some of all that said, what I want to do is dig into a few different use cases, and we'll go into a bit of detail on them, and then we'll come back and summarize it all. So these are, when we talk to our customers, like these are like the big use cases that come up. There's three big ones. The first is internal access requests and just handling general team changes. So again, in an ideal world, like every employee in an organization would fit into one particular role or maybe a few different roles that would then grant them access to certain resources. But I think, again, we all know that's not really the reality. There always are going to be, exceptions to that, or sets of employees that sort of fit between different groups. And so I think that when we're talking about sort of internal access requests, it's for the exception use cases, it's having systems in place that handle automatic expiration of access. That means that they could be either time-based or actually usage-based. And so again, we'll talk about this in a second, but being able to handle access grants that expire for a certain amount of time or expire if not used after a certain amount of time actually really help streamline this process for internal requests. The second one is really broader, which is really giving access to anybody outside of the organization. And so those three roles tend to be contractors, partner organizations, and temporary sort of guest users. So this is similar. This is similar to sort of the internal team requests with some differences around how identity is handled. But generally, these are more time-based expiration rules, right? So they tend to be focused on a contract or contract length or a particular partnership agreement with another organization. So those are simpler but still need to be managed. And then the other one is we talk a lot with organizations that have production systems that they're managing, is really having a process for break glass scenarios, right? So if something goes wrong, how can you ensure that people have access to the systems, the production systems that need attention, without having that access be completely open all the time? And so again, we'll talk about this workflow in a little more detail, but what this really involves is dovetailing on-call teams and what their permissions are, and cycling people through that on-call role so that this only applies while they're on call, and then either deciding whether you need approval or sort of more like a trust but verify workflow to audit actions, right? So we'll talk about that in a second. Okay, so we'll start with sort of like the easier one, right, which is internal access requests and team changes. So the goals are, as I was saying a little bit earlier, are really about assigning resource based on someone's department or their role in the organization, but then also making sure that you have flexibility. And I believe that, like, talking to most companies, that most people do have this flexibility to actually trim access to things that aren't used. And it's up to you how you want to handle that. But I think that's actually pretty important, because roles, just by their very nature, fairly broad, and that goes exactly against the security principle of trying to narrow access to what people to the least, the smallest set of things they should have access to. And so what it comes down to is really being able to set rules for like what those resource like access requests actually look like. So the general workflow is sort of like the obvious one. The starting point is assign resources to people based on their team, and then make some decisions about how you want to handle access requests, right? So in our sort of theoretical example here with Tableau, which is a data visualization querying platform, what you might want to do is you might want to say, fine, like the data science and marketing teams are by default granted access, but if they don't use this application for, let's say, 90 days, then that access will be removed. And it's up to the tool to decide like whether that access can be automatically re-granted if the user wants to. So they basically just put in a request and it's just automatically granted with a reason. Maybe with an authentication check, obviously, before they do that. And then secondly, you can also say that to handle sort of requests for different teams that aren't assigned to the application, whether you want to allow internal access requests from other teams. And so this lets you sort of like really customize like how you want to allow people to access this application, and automate the processes through the automatic trimming or workflows that are really self-serve from user standpoint. And for people that do request access, as we'll see a little bit later in the on-call example, having an option for the user to explain like why they need access, and then trusting that that access is legitimate, lets you then audit those changes later on, right? So you can have a whole process around this, and that really reduces friction. While for something like a Tableau resource, like is sort of like an acceptable kind of security risk. Okay, so that's the first example. So fairly straightforward. The second one, just getting a little bit more complicated here. The key thing around all this is that with external partners, it's really making sure that you're not providing broad credentials right outside the organization. So you don't want sort of credentials are being reused by external folks. Like ideally, if you're going to do this in a way that you're reducing that blast radius and maintaining least privilege access, is you want to assign access to people in, in our example here, and in a particular role, but that's also tied to that person's, identity. Now that identity can either be something that you define internally in your company identity provider, or it can be an external identity tied to their email address through, various methods, right? Office 365, Google, and so on. And so that's the first thing, is making sure that you're tying access to an individual. Otherwise, everything else really doesn't matter after that. And then it's generally with these external folks, it's making sure that the access that they've been granted, while of course is like limited to a particular set of resources they need, is also time-based. And so that's just simply aligning it with whatever the situation is with that third party. And if something is sort of more ongoing, you can basically say that every certain period of time, every 30, 90 days, that access needs to be renewed. Right? So it depends on your sort of organization's tolerance for risk. And so that's the general objectives there. And so again, like from a workflow standpoint, like how you would configure this in any particular tool is you establish the identity, right, for this external individual. You assign them to a particular role that has a set of configured options for like how their access should be managed, right? So in the example here on the left with this particular user, we've got like an access request sort of like view here, but in that view, what we're doing is we're actually setting the parameters, right? So we're saying that this person comes from the contractor role, belongs to certain groups, and what we're going to do as part of approving this request is we're going to approve it for a particular set of time, and after that time's expired, we'll then remove that person's access. So that's generally the workflow, and I think you can get a lot more detailed, again, depending on the type of like tool that you're using, to determine whether there should be certain restrictions on the particular device that the user is using, whether you want to modify some of the sort of regular authentication checks and so on. Like all that can be tied in. But from an ephemeral standpoint, what you want is that access limited in time and workflow that fits how you assign access to external parties. Okay, so the third one is for the break glass process. This is sort of like the exciting one here, is that really what you want to do is you want to have a situation where users can gain access to, we'll just use the example of production system, right? You gain access to a production system that needs attention in an emergency. So system's gone down, something else, some kind of an outage is happening, but is limiting that escalation to the group of people that need that, right? So you don't want to just give, let's say, the entire engineering team access to your production network to be able to handle outages, because that doesn't fit with the principle of least privilege access and then limiting that blast radius. So instead, what you really want is you want to limit the escalation path to a group of people that, ideally are in, for example, like an on-call team. So a lot of companies have sort of this on-call role that people sit in and that people rotate through. And so what you're doing is you want to set this up such a way that on-call role, where people move through that role, is able to escalate privileges when needed. And in order to ensure that you don't introduce too much friction, is basically allow the users in that group to escalate automatically, or escalate sort of the user is able to initiate the escalation, and that they simply provide an auditable reason as to why, so that anything can be checked later. And the great thing is that I think this is a great compromise here, because this reduces friction, right? So someone doesn't have to go ask for permission to do something, so that they can, at least on the on-call team, so they can respond to the issue quickly. But then everything that they're doing once they receive that privilege escalation is audited back to exactly who they are, right? So their user identity, the device they're using, like where they're coming from, like everything is like very deep, audited in a very detailed way. And then the last part of all this is just when you're setting up this process, is just making sure that that escalation path is time bound, right? So whether the individual moves off of that on-call role, of course your access should be removed at that point, but it's actually just like time bounding what that privilege escalation is valid for. Okay, so just to summarize, like the workflow is, you basically assign this break glass role, so it's probably an on-call role. users should be synced through that role. And so lots of different ways to do this can be done directly through IDP, can be done through other tools like PagerDuty or OpsGenie, anything else you're using to manage on-call privileges. And then as part of that role is actually assign or rather set a policy for that role that individuals in that role are allowed to escalate when needed. And then again, like optionally, you want to gate access that resource with an audited reason, so have the user provide a reason, or if you wanted to, you could allow access like for that role. But having the audited reason lets you have a process in place where the user actually has to take an action to be given access to those privileged resources. And then the last thing is then just assign some kind of time bound to it. So whatever you think makes sense for your organization, whether that's minutes, hours, or days. All right, so I think those are 3 examples that we wanted to run through. What I wanted to just do is a little bit just to talk a little more about what we do, like as an organization, and how all this fits in. So our team is from we've come from all kinds of different organizations. Like most of us have spent a lot of time in the enterprise or B2B space, from a bunch of companies that you recognize. But we're really passionate about building like elegant solutions to sort of complex problems. And so the complex problem that we're focused on at the moment is really helping companies adopt zero trust principles. And zero trust is a pretty broad term, and it is really a set of principles, and they can be relatively difficult to adopt depending on your sort of chosen path. So we're really passionate about making that easy for our customers. So a lot of our customers, I think a lot of the examples sort of come from a lot of these folks and a lot of the prospects that we've spoken to. A lot of these companies are like really fast growing companies that have, internal, pretty advanced like internal sort of software development teams. And so, a lot of the examples we've just given are like really relevant like to these types of organizations where access to privileged internal resources is kind of a daily part of their workflow. And so let me talk about like our approach and sort of what our like products like solution and architecture looks like. For a bit of introduction, like if you're used to VPN sort of centric model of the world, there's generally like one VPN gateway or a handful of VPN gateways that then grant you access into an internal sort of like privileged world, right? So it's the idea of, if you've heard the analogy before of this castle and moat model, where everything's inside the castle, and then the way in is via that drawbridge across the moat, and that's your VPN typically. So our model is a little bit different. As you've heard me say a few times around this concept of least privilege access, like our goal is really to make sure that you can define your sort of internal like network infrastructure as it makes sense for your organization, and then make sure that individuals really only have access to that smallest set of things that they're entitled to access. And so the way that we do that is we have a pretty different architecture where instead of having like one or two or a small set of gateways that give you access to broad swaths of your internal infrastructure, is that we have this sort of like client connector architecture where the connector sits behind the firewall, so it's invisible to the outside world, and then acts as a proxy to send traffic internally to only the specific resources that a user is entitled to. And so everything ties back to that user's identity, what role they're in, all the different access methods that we just talked about earlier, all that's enforced by the system. And so the benefit from a user standpoint is that they get basically point-to-point or peer-to-peer connections like from the client on their device to the connector that sits inside the network, and then directly onto the application they're looking to access. And so one of the benefits of an approach like this, and we're not the only company out there that does this, of course, but is that all the rules around ephemeral access and so on, like all can apply to any type of application internally. So it doesn't matter whether it's whether you're SSHing into a server, or you're accessing a database using a database client on your device, or it's web-based access. All those rules can be applied uniformly across absolutely everything. Okay, so just to kind of like summarize, I think like a little bit like how our solution like fits into all this and like how it ties back to sort of enforcing ephemeral access is that we're really focused on providing access again at the resource level, and I think that's super important. Like when you're looking at improving security through, again, through ephemeral access is that the access ultimately has to be focused on controlling access to a particular resource for a particular user coming from a particular device. So that's super important. Otherwise, a lot of those rules really don't get you, or a lot of those policies don't really get you the maximum sort of benefit from a security standpoint. The second thing is that, as I just mentioned a second ago, actually, so having a single system, right, that actually sets these policies and enforces these rules across any type of application, I think is really important. Because again, as we mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, there's a lot of pain, I think, that comes from trying to make, this sort of patchwork quilt of systems work together. For example, like what we've very commonly seen is you've got one system to manage, SSH key assignment, you've got another system to manage, your on-call processes, you've got another system to manage access, which is like very often a VPN, and then you've got maybe some PAM solution that's installed on, some subset of your internal network. And making it all work together is really hard. So we do think like a single system makes a lot of sense. And then having, I think, some combination of not just time-based but usage-based actually lets you get pretty close to a model where in sort of steady state with all the changes that typically happen internally, you have your employees assign access to the minimum set of resources that they need access to. And then I think having some flexibility in there, right? So I think having flexibility in the system to address, again, any type of application, any type of network, any type of workflow is really important, rather than having something like very narrowly focused on a particular use case. And so going back to our examples, if you have a system that's flexible enough to meet sort of like the day-to-day needs for employees, as well as the break glass scenario, you're going to be I think in a lot better shape than just focusing only on like the break glass use case, for example. All right, well, appreciate the time. I think what we'll do is we'll leave it open for some questions. So let me see if I can pull up the Q&A thing here. So if anybody has any questions, please do feel free to ask. Looks like we've got a few here. So somebody was asking, what the difference is between ephemeral access and just-in-time access, or JIT. And I think there's actually really, they're really sort of like different terms for like the same thing. I think the reality is, I think for all of these types of workflows, what you're really trying to do is make sure that if you pick a given point in time for any given employee, that at that point they really only have access to the minimal set of resources they need access to, and everything that all the policies that you sort of sit around that determine your it's a sort of a mix of risk tolerance. So are there particular systems for which you'll just let people request access to and self-report, or are there more sensitive systems where you actually want some approval process in place from a delegated admin or like a super admin, something like that? So, but I think at the end of the day, I think like ephemeral access, just in time, like pretty similar, as long as you have this principle of least privilege access, and then there's some method for that access to expire at a certain point in time. All right, so we got another question here around securing SSH. So one thing that we didn't really talk about here is there's a couple different approaches here. So when you're talking about sort of SSH into a host or a set of hosts, generally you need to assign keys to access that host. And so I think that there's sort of two schools of thought here. One is that you use the keys that are assigned to a particular user to access a particular destination as the way to control access. So the first school of thought is, if they can access a network, that's fine, but if their keys aren't valid, then they won't be able to access those resources. Right? So that's the first school of thought. I think the second school of thought is that if you can control access at the network level, then even if they do have keys which haven't yet been expired, for whatever situation, then there's nothing that they can do. So I think personally, I think what we favor, and what seems to be a lot easier for customers to manage, is actually controlling access at the network level. And so from sort of like first principles standpoint, if my user identity is tied to a system which controls my ability to access any particular destination on internal networks, then even if my key management system is a little bit out of sync, there's some time delay there, the access is immediately cut off. The second part of this is that controlling access at the network levels is probably more effective from a security standpoint, because if we favor blocking off network access versus access to a particular host, you remove at least one particular attack vector where you're preventing someone from probing systems, right? So even if my key is not valid, there may be other vulnerabilities on a particular host that you're trying to protect. So I do think that key management is an important part of this equation, and that is super important. But I do think like blocking access at network level tends to be easier for folks, and actually has some like great security benefits as well. All right, looking at other questions here. Let's see. So we have a question here about I guess just like different sort of system diversity, right? So different people are using like different platforms to access internal resources. So the question is like, how does that affect the ability to implement something like this? So again, I think it's actually kind of similar to like the key question. So I think what you should be looking for if you're looking at, again, implementing a solution or going down a path where you want to ensure that you're implementing sort of ephemeral access for employees, is look at a solution that really is sort of agnostic to the particular platform that people are using and the particular destination application. Because if you're sort of just in time, or your ephemeral access solution only works for certain users on certain platforms and for certain types of destination applications, then you're going to get a lot less value out of it than if you find a solution that works at a network level and doesn't care what the source system is that you're coming from. So that's generally been, I think, what we've seen with customers is that they're most effective with solutions that can be deployed as broadly as possible internally without having platform specific needs or quirks. All right, I think that's it on the question front. I think we'll hand it back over to Dizon.
All right, well, Dizon would like to thank Alex for a great presentation. Dizon would also like to thank Twingate for providing the audience with a fantastic webinar. And lastly, thank you to everyone who attended today. We hope you learned something new that will help you in your developer career.
If you'd like to try out Twingate for free today, we'd love to have you join our Zero Trust journey. You can see the product in action live by signing up at twingate.com/signup. Thanks so much for your time, and hope to see some of you very soon.